Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel on Mir Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Kuf Chaf Amid Beis. We have some leftover business on Kuf Chaf Amid Aleph, so we begin today on Kuf Chaf Amid Aleph, 4 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Yud Daled Sif Beis. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kameis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzara Bashivya, Ha'imdim Ben Bayamu Ben Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Alehem, V'Yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afel L'Oira Mishibah L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema from Hashemeir Ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Tzim Ben Dusha, Rivka Bas Shira Leo, Chavadas Bas Serel, and Avraham Ben Tzion Ben Sarah Liba. They should have a refuah shalema b'sar shar chayil Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonisem ben Michal and Yoel ben Michal. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over them, together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. So, we have been learning the halachas of binyan and stira in kelim. What are you allowed to do to a keli? What are you not allowed to do a keli? We learned so far that if you have a shvacha keli, if you have a very inferior keli, a keli that was broken and then repaired, it was glued together. So he said, by such a keli, you would be allowed to go ahead and break it to get access to its contents. Why? Because this would be an application of ein stira b'kelim. Since this is a very shvacha keli, a very inferior keli, we don't see demolishing it as being stira gemura. We don't see this as being a true act of stira, and therefore there's no problem of stira. If you have a fine, intact keli, then you're not allowed to go ahead and smash it, because that would be stira. By stira gemura, by a real act of demolishing, we do not say ein stira b'kelim. Then we've also discussed a whole different isser, the isser of tikud moneh, which is a form of makeh b'patish. When you take something and you turn it into a keli, this is a problem of tikud moneh, which is a form of makeh b'patish, which is also an av malacha on Shabbos. So, in the context of that halacha, we said, what if you have an inferior keli? I guess I'm going to use the word refurbished. You have a refurbished keli, this keli that had been broken and glued back together. So we said, if you want to smash it to get to its contents, that you could do, because ein stira b'kelim. But would you be allowed to go ahead and fashion a nice opening, a Pesach, into this keli? That you can't do. Why? Because that would be tikud moneh. Now, you're not smashing the keli, you're not destroying the keli, you're keeping the keli intact. And you're going ahead and you're making a significant improvement to the keli, you're fashioning a nice functional opening to the keli. That would be a problem of tikud moneh. Now, we spoke about this could be an issa d'Rabbanan, it could be an issa d'Oraisa. How big do you make the hole? If you make the hole that's lahachnis ulahoitzi, a hole which could be used to let liquids come out, and you could also use it to refill the keli, that could be an issa d'Oraisa. If you make a small hole, something that's only lahoitzi but not lahachnis, that would be an issa d'Rabbanan. Okay. Then we said another halacha. We said when you have an intact keli, of course you're not allowed to make a Pesach in the keli. You're also not allowed to make, the Mechaber told us, a nekev ba'alma. You're not even allowed to make a small little hole in the side of the keli. And again, that would be an issa d'Rabbanan, because we're afraid that if you go ahead and you make a little hole, you might come to make a big hole, which is made to be lahachnis ulahoitzi. The Mechaber also told us if you have an existing hole, you're not allowed to widen the hole. Even if you don't widen it to the extent that it's lahaitzi or lahachnis, still you're not allowed to widen the hole. Again, it would be an issa d'Rabbanan to widen the hole even a little bit, because of the fear that you might come to go ahead and make a hole that is big enough lahachnis or lahaitzi, which would be an issa d'Oraisa. Now, against this whole backdrop, let's turn to Sif Beis. In Sif Beis and in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber is going to be tackling the question of, what if you have a keli, so you have a chavis, you have this wooden barrel, and the barrel had an opening, and the opening became closed up, and now it was resealed. You had an opening, and the opening was resealed. Now you want to reopen it. So is reopening is opening a resealed pre-existing opening, is that a problem? Is it a problem of tikkun moneh? So let's see what the Mechaber says here. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, Haya ba nekev, if you have this chavis, this barrel, and it had a nekev, it had a hole, v'nistam, and it became closed up. You closed up the hole. Are you allowed to reopen it? Says the Mechaber, it depends. Im hu lamata min hashmarim, it depends where the hole is on the keli. Is the hole very low down? Lamata min hashmarim means it's below the level of where the sediment builds up at the bottom of the barrel. If the opening that you want to reopen is so low down on the barrel that it's below the level of the sediment buildup, then also lepaschai. Then you're not allowed to reopen it. Why not? Explains the Mechaber, Dekeven shehu lamata, because since this opening is so low down on the barrel, v'chol kaivet hayayin olav, so there was a lot of pressure on the place where this opening was, right? Let's think about it. If you have a tall keli, the higher up on the keli you have the opening, the less pressure there is on that opening. But if you have it all the way down, kol kaivet hayayin, all of the pressure of all the contents of that barrel are going to be exerted onto the makom, onto the place that had that opening. So what? Says the Mechaber, if you had an opening so low down on the keli, that opening, when you sealed it up, you had to do a really good job of sealing it. Because had you not done a good job of sealing it, it would leak. So what? Therefore, says the Mechaber, v'choshev k'paiseach mechodosh. If you have an opening that was so low down on the barrel, you had to do a really good job of sealing it, and therefore we consider it sealed. Now, when you go to reopen it, we look at it that you're fashioning a new opening in the keli. Fashioning a new opening in the keli is a problem of tikkun moneh. But l'maylam and ashmarim, but if the opening was higher than the sediment level, so it wasn't under so much pressure, and it didn't need to be so well sealed, in that case, mutar lepaschai. Then you're allowed to reopen it. Why? Because we don't consider it to ever have been closed. The closure that you did, because you were able to do an inferior closure, because it wasn't under so much pressure, now when you go and reopen it, we don't look at it that you're making a new opening. It was an opening, and now it's weiter an opening. We don't look at this as being tikkun moneh. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Yud Gimel. Nekev v'nistam. You had an opening and you closed it up. Now, in the first case of the Mechaber, where this opening was low down on the keli, we say you're not allowed to open it up. Why are you not allowed to open it up? Because we look at it as if you're making a new opening. The seal was such a good seal, when you reopen it now, we look at it that you're making a new opening. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is true. Even if this place that you're now going to reopen, it was a bona fide opening. It was the opening where the spigot was. So this is like the established place for an opening on the keli. That would be a reason to think maybe we don't consider it being such a reseal. We don't look that it was really sealed up because it's in the makom habarza, which was like a real official opening. So even though you sealed it up, maybe it's not considered sealed. And now when you make an opening, we look at it as being a new opening. Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes, we do. And you wanted to close, you closed up the place where the original spigot was, and now you made a new spigot somewhere else. And now you want to reopen the original barza. So you might think, is that really making a new opening? Nah, this is where the barza was. This is where the spigot was. I'm not really making a new opening. Yes, since it's low down on the barrel, and it was very well sealed, opening it now constitutes making a new opening. Ice cutting your dalit. The chashuv kepesach bechadash, opening it now is considered making a new opening. V'alkein also lasis sham afilu neck of katan shein also lahachtis lahitzi al yadai. Now you're not even allowed to make a tiny opening where it had been sealed, because it's like making a new opening. And remember, when you make a new opening in a keli, even if you make a small opening, it's an issur d'Rabbanan of tikkun maneh, because we're afraid if we allow you to make a small opening, you might make a big opening that's also lahitzi or lahachnis, which would be an issur d'oraisa. He's cutting tesvav. But if the opening was high up on the keli, above the sediment level, then mutar l'paschai. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is true, afilu hu nekev gadol. Even if the hole that you're making now is going to be a big hole, it's still mutter to make a big hole in this place that had been resealed. Because even though you closed it up, we don't consider it to be a closure. It's an inferior closure, and therefore we don't look at it as being a closure. So when you go and you make an opening now in that spot, we don't look at it that you're making a new opening. We don't see a problem of tikkun maneh. Says the Mechaber Sif Gimel. B'mekayim nekev yashan. Dealing on the same issue, if you're going to make an opening in a place that had been opened and then sealed, and it's a place where you're allowed to make such an opening, it's above the sediment level, so now you're allowed to reopen this place that had been closed, because we don't see it as having been closed. You can make the hole that you're going to make now even using a drill. Says the Mishnah Berurah. What do you mean a drill? I don't mean you could go get your Milwaukee power drill and use a Shabbos, which of course you're not allowed to do. What's this makdeach? Pirush, says the Ramah. Kli meyuchad linkov. This is like an awl or like a hand thing. That's a drill that you're going to do to drill out this opening that had been reclosed. Kigoin shenishbara habarza. And the Mechaber gives an example. He says the barza broke, and now because the barza broke and it got stuffed up or sealed up, you want to drill it out and reopen the opening. You're allowed to do it even with the makdeach. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, whether this old opening that got closed up, whether it was a big opening or a small opening, so again, the halacha that the Mechaber is saying over here is, in the case where you're allowed to reopen an old opening. What's that case? It's the case where it's above the sediment level. So when you closed it or it got closed, it's an inferior closure. And therefore you're allowed to reopen it. Says the Mechaber, you're even allowed to use a makdeach. Even though you're using a keli that's made for this kind of thing, there might be an aspect of uvda dechoil over here. It doesn't matter, you're allowed to do it anyway. But the Mishnah Berurah puts in a caveat, but you can't widen the hole more than it originally was, because to do that would run afoul of the halacha that we learned on the top line of Kuf Chaf Amud Aleph in the Mechaber, that when you have a pre-existing hole, you're not allowed to make it wider. That's an issur d'Rabbanan, because we're afraid if we allow you to make existing holes wider, you might come to make a hole that's lahitzi or lahachnis, which would be an issur d'oraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, as cut yud zayin noikvan afilu b'makdeach. You could even use this drill. Deloi chashiv estima klal. Remember, because since this opening is in a place that you're allowed to reopen it, and it was an inferior closure, we don't see it as having ever been closed. Kevichu l'maylim and hashmarim v'chanal. V'lachein mutar linkov b'magufa shesoispen ba'aklis chuchis shekarin shtopki. Afilu b'kli amasuk l'kach. Says the Mishnah Berurah. From here you could see the halacha that if you have a glass bottle and it has a magufa, it has a stopper, let's say a cork, in the opening of the bottle, you're allowed to drill it out. You could go take a corkscrew, and not only can you take a corkscrew and make a hole in the cork with which to pull the cork out, you could drill the whole cork out. Why? Because we don't see this closure as ever having been a real closure, and therefore you're allowed to go ahead and drill it out. Ois cut yud ches habarza. The Mechaber gave us a case over here where the barza broke, and what you're doing over here is you want to drill out the place that had the barza. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the only reason that the Mechaber is selecting this as the example is because this was a common problem. This is something that happened often. The Mechaber is not telling you that this halacha only applies if you're trying to reopen the Makam Abarza. You're allowed to reopen an old opening anywhere where it is on the Keli, so long as it's Lamaila from the level of the Shmarim. Continues the Mechaber on Kuf Chaf Amud Beis, where he brings down a more stringent opinion. V'yesh Oimrim, there are those that say this is the Shitas HaKolboi. V'yesh Oimrim, the Loishari Linkov Nekev Yashan. There is a Madyama that says that you're not allowed to reopen an old hole. Ela b'chavish al cheres she'ena stima muhudekes yafeh. There's a Yesh Oimrim, a Kolboi, that says that this halacha of reopening an old hole, this heter, only applies to an earthenware cask. Why? Because by an earthenware cask, when you go to reseal a pre-existing opening, you can't seal it well. Remember, earthenware is a very stiff, very brittle material. It doesn't have give. So when you close it up with something, but it's not going to be a tight seal, especially if it's lamaila mimakam hashmarim. It's not going to be a tight seal. Therefore, it's an inferior closure. We don't see it as ever having been closed, and therefore you're allowed to reopen it on Shabbos. But, says the Mechaber, the end of the top line, Aval b'chavit shel eitz. But if you're dealing with a wooden cask, shemahatkim ma'oid ha'eitz, shesoispid b'hanekev, where when you put in a plug into a wooden cask, you put it in very tightly. Wood has give. Therefore, you could take a plug and you could pound it into the hole, and you could take a stopper, you could take a plug that's really a little bit bigger than the hole, and you could force it in, because the plug will contract a little and the wood of the cask will expand a little, and you end up with a very tight plug. And says the Mechaber, not only is the plug going to be tight, after you put the plug in, what do? The choitchim roishai, then you go ahead and you cut off the excess of the plug that's sticking out. So you force in a plug, then you go ahead and you cut it flush with the wall of the plug, and says the Mechaber, why do you do this? Al das shaloi lo hitzioi. Because this plug is considered a permanent plug. When you go ahead and you plug a wooden cask, you make such a permanent plug that you cut off the excess and you make the exterior wall of the cask nice and smooth. Why? Because this is a permanent plug. You intend for it to remain there forever. So therefore, says the Mechaber, Vaday nireh shezen nekev chadash va'aser. This is the stringent opinion of the Kolboi. The Kolboi says that by a wooden cask, I'm not going to let you reopen an old opening, even if it's lamaila mimakam hashmarim, because that plug was put in to be very tight and to be a permanent plug. I'm not going to allow you now to go make a new opening there. That would be like making a new opening anywhere else on the keli, in the wall of the keli. You're not allowed to do that. That's tikkun moneh. The only heter to reopen an old opening is because we don't see the seal as being a real seal. But over here, we consider it to be a real seal. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut your test. V'yesharim loishari zui dasa kolbai. This is the opinion of the kolbai. V'ayin bel Yerabba shekasav t'shar paiskim pligi alzeh. The El Yerabba says all the other paiskim disagree with this kolbai. Upasak kamoisam. The El Yerabba paskins like these other paiskim. V'chein pasak v'nachlas tzvi. Avo b'priba gadim v'chayodam mashma. T'yesh lachish lahachmer kedasa yeshayimrim. The Pri Begadim, the Chayodam, they imply that we should take this opinion very seriously and we should be machmer. Moving along to Sif Dalit, 3 lines down, Kuf Chaf Amud Beis, says the Mechaber, Barze shebechavis ve'ein adam yachal lohitzia. If you have a spigot in the barrel, now their spigots were very primitive spigots. A spigot essentially was a tube. Sometimes it was actually made out of a koneh, a reed, like we're going to see. So you have a tube, and you put a tube inside a hole, and that acts as a spigot to allow the wine to come out. Now, what happened is, barze shebechavis, you have this spigot in the barrel, ve'ein adam yachal lohitzia. They can't get the spigot out. Why do they want to get the spigot out? So it's maybe an old chavis with an old spigot, and you got a lot of buildup and sediment inside the spigot, and the wine is no longer flowing out through this kaneh, through this spigot. So it's time to replace it. Now, the spigot had to be inserted into the wall of the chavis rather tightly. Otherwise, wine would leak out around the tube of the spigot. So the spigot was put in tight. It was put in very firmly. Now you need to replace the barza. You need to replace the spigot because I guess it's all clogged up. So you need to replace it. But it's in so firmly that they can't get it out. So says the Mechaber, you know what you could do? If the bars of the chavis needs to be replaced and nobody could get it out, you could take the new barza, use the new barza to hammer at the old barza. So what are you going to do? You're going to knock the old barza into the barrel, and the new barza is going to take its place in the hole. And now, in essence, you're fashioning an opening. Before, it was gunked up, it was clogged up, the wine couldn't come out. Now you're knocking out the old barza and you're knocking in a new barza. Says the Mechaber, you're allowed to do this. He says it's l'tzarich lishtais yayin b'Shabbos. You're allowed to do it if you need to drink wine on Shabbos. Points out the Ramah, but remember the requirements of the previous sif. But you can't do this if the spigot is down below the sediment level. Because essentially what you're doing now is you're reopening an old opening, right? The original barza, the original spigot constitutes an opening. It got clogged up. So this is a nekev v'nistam. This is an opening that got closed up. Now by pounding in the new barza, you're reopening an old opening. Well, you're only allowed to reopen an old opening if it's above the shmarim level. If it's below the shmarim level, you're not allowed to do it. That's what the point that the Ramah is making over here. Now let's take a look here at the... Oh, there is no Mishnah Berurah. Nope, there's no Mishnah Berurah here. Okay. Says the Mechaber weiter, Sif Hey. Mutter litain kaneh chalul. You're allowed to take a tube. You're allowed to take a reed, a hollow reed. So that's essentially a tube. Perfect to be used as a barza. Mutter litain kaneh chalul. You're allowed to take the hollow tube and put it bechavis into the barrel. Oi barza. Or you could take a spigot and put it into the barza, into the chavis. What's the difference over here? It sounds like the kaneh is kind of like a more primitive version of a barza. A barza is maybe a professionally made barza. There's a barza, there's authentic barza. It comes in a package, barza. The kaneh is the kaneh that you're going to use for the barza. Says the Mechaber, mutter liten kanel chalol b'chavis. You're allowed to put the hollow tube, the hollow reed, into the chavis to use it as a spigot, oi barza. Or you could put in a barza, lahoitzi yayin, in order to extract wine from the barrel. And says the Mechaber, you can do this af al pi shaloi hoya b'mei olam. Even though this barza was never used in this barrel, it's a brand new barza, a brand new spigot that you're installing into this chavis. Even if this kaneh, this reed that you want to use, was never used in this chavis, you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to do this. Now, we're wondering right now, what's the chiddush over here? What's the halacha that the Mechaber is telling me? What is this a shaila of? Clearly, we're not talking about stira. This has nothing to do with demolishing. This seems to be halachas that pertain to tikkun maneh. Are we fashioning a keli when we go ahead and we install this barza or we install this kaneh into the chavis? Are we running up against an iser of tikkun maneh? Says the Mechaber, no, we're not. Let's take a look at what's at play. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah's cut and chaf. Mutter litain. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the reason this is mutter is shaharei oimid umiyuchid lekach. What does this mean? He means that the reed that you're going to use for the spigot, or certainly the barza, the new barza that you got to put onto the chavis, you're not turning those into kalim. Those are already kalim. Why? Because they are oimid umiyuchad lekach. The barza is definitely oymen miyuchad lekach. It is a spigot. Says it seems that the koneh is also a koneh that's oymen miyuchad lekach. So maybe you saved certain types of reeds that were particularly usable as spigots for casks of wine. So this reed and this barza, there's no shaila here of tikkun moneh, that by going in and putting it on the chavis, you're turning the reed or the spigot into a keli. They're already kelim. There's no tikkun moneh on them. The barrel is definitely already a keli. You're not doing tikkun moneh on the barrel. And as far as an opening, the opening is already there apparently. It's just a question of putting in the spigot. So there's no shaila here of tikkun moneh on anything. That's what seems to be at work over here. So again, Mishnah Berurah, as far as the reed or the barza, those are oymen miyuchad lekach. So you're not doing anything to them that constitutes a shaila of tikkun moneh. Ve'ena mesakin kli. So there's no tikkun moneh here. Ubekamakim nirid asal iskaya hete v'chaska b'yasedos tiyesh bazeh mishum gemar melacha. However, to go ahead and install the barza or the reed using screws or nails or anything like that, that already, says the Mishnah Berurah, that already would be a problem of somehow gemar melacha. I think, if I'm understanding the Mishnah Berurah properly, I think what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, we're compartmentalizing this shaila. There's no question here of tikkun moneh. If we look at it that we have a chavis with an opening, and we're just simply taking a barza and pushing it in, taking a koneh, pushing it in, we don't seem to have any shaila. We have no tikkun moneh on the koneh or the barza, because those are oymen miyuchad lekach. We have no tikkun moneh on the chavis, because the chavis already is a keli. Right? So, says the Mechaber, no problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but to take the barza or the koneh and really build it onto the keli with screws or nails or pegs or anything else, that is tikkun moneh. Why? Because it sounds like he's saying, now you're doing a gemar melacha, you're making a new keli. You're making a chavis with a barza. Now, if you mamish build the barza or the koneh into the chavis on a permanent basis, you're creating a new keli. Before it was a chavis without a barza, now it's a chavis with a barza. So that would be a shaila of tikkun moneh. Now, the Mechaber then told us you're allowed to do this, even if this barza or this koneh was never installed in this chavis, you're allowed to take the barza or the koneh and put it into the chavis now. The question is, what's the chiddush here? What's this af al pi? Even though this barza, this koneh, was never used on this chavis, he's still allowed to do it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Kat L'Chaf Aleph, Va'af agav she'eni yodea im yagia limidasai. If you're using this koneh or this barza for the first time with this chavis, you might run up with a problem. What happens if you go to put it in and you realize the size isn't right? Now you might want to go ahead and cut the koneh. You might want to go ahead and make an adjustment of some kind on the barza. Now you're coming up against, you would think, now you're coming up against tikkun moneh. If you're making changes into the barza or into the koneh, that's tikkun moneh. So you might think if you never installed this barza or this koneh into this chavis, maybe there should be an issa d'Rabbanan. We're not going to let you do it for the first time because you might come to cut it. Kamash Malon, that no, you are allowed to. Afilu hachi mutter. V'ayim bebeis Yosef, take a look at the Beis Yosef, says the Mishnah Berurah, Shekasav, who writes, Shenirim medivrei Rambam, it appears from the words of the Rambam, She'af al pi she'akona atzma einu mesukenes kol tzarcha, v'chaser shum tikkun. Even if you see that really this barza, or really this koneh, does need some adjusting to work properly, afilu hachi mutter lahachnisa, you're still allowed to put it in. For some reason, we're not choishish that you might come to do a tikkun on the barza or the koneh to make it more appropriate for this chavis. Okay, let's go weiter in Sif Hey. So we are now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines off the top of Chaf Amid Bey's middle of the line, says the Mechaber. So, the Mechaber just said, you're allowed to go ahead and put in a barza or a koneh. Now the Mechaber is going to tell you something that you're not allowed to do. Very interesting halacha. Avalitein ola shal hadas. You want to take the leave of a hadas. Now, I'm thinking that this must mean that they had hadassim with large leaves. I can't imagine. It's hard for me to imagine the mitzius of this shaila with a tiny little hadas leaf. It must be that they had bigger leaves. They had hadassim with bigger leaves. Says the Mechaber, Litein ola shal hadas banekev shebechavis. If you want to take a hadas leaf, you know how the hadas leaf has that vein that goes down the center so that it gives you a nice kind of like seam to fold the leaf on? What you want to do is you have the chavis. The chavis has an opening. You want wine to flow nicely out of the opening. You don't want it to dribble out and dribble down the side of the cask. You want it to flow out and flow away. So what you want to do is you want to take a hadas leaf, you want to fold it, and you want to tuck it into the opening. So now it should be like a marzev. What's a marzev? A gutter. It should be like a half pipe that's going to channel the wine out of the opening of the chavis. That the Mechaber says you're not allowed to do. Let's see it inside. Aval. Litein ola shal hadas banekev. To insert a hadas leaf into the hole of the chavis. Sheha ola also kamarzev. So that the leaf should act like a gutter. V'hayayin zov derech sham. And the wine will flow out the leaf and flow nicely out of the chavis. Loy. That you're not allowed to do. So to put in a barza, you're allowed to do. To put in a koneh, you're allowed to do. But to fold a hadas leaf and put it in, that you're not allowed to do. Why not? Interesting halacha. The Gazrinon, because the Mechaber says we make a gzera, shalo yisakein marzev liyenoi. We don't want to allow you to fashion a marzev, a half pipe, a gutter, for your yayin, sheyipal yayin l'soichai, that the wine is going to come into and flow out. You're going to use this leaf to direct the flow of the wine away from the wall of the cask, v'yelech l'merachaik, so that the wine should flow out away from the cask. We don't want to allow you to do that. Why? Because when you take the leaf and you fold it along that middle vein, ke'ein marzev, you're folding it to make it like a half pipe. Nireh ka'oisa marzev. It looks like you're building a gutter. V'loy dami lebarza oikoneh she'ena oisa b'shomaisa. Very interesting what the Mechaber is saying over here. The Mechaber says, he brings this down really from a Gemara. What the Mechaber is saying is that when you take a barza, the barza is fashioned to do what it does. It's already a keli. You don't have to do anything to it. You just have to insert it into the chavis. When you take the koneh, the reed, that's like a tube, you don't have to do anything to it. You just take it and you stick it into the opening. That's okay. But when you use a leaf, you take the leaf and you fold it and you fashion a marzev. You fashion a half pipe to direct the flow of the wine. That's a problem because we're afraid that if we allow you to do that, you might come to actually fashion a marzev. You might actually go take a piece of metal or go take a piece of wood and actually fashion out a marzev for the same purpose. And that would be tikkun moneh. To take a piece of wood and chisel it out and hollow it out and make a marzev, to take a piece of metal and form it into a marzev, that would be tikkun moneh. To take a leaf and fold it in half is not tikkun moneh. But they look like the same maisa, and therefore we don't allow you to do this with the leaf. Says the, I don't think, is there any Mishnah Berurah on this? No, there is no Mishnah Berurah on this. Weiter. Says the Ramah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines off the bottom, near the beginning of the line, says the Ramah, Hagah, V'yesh matirim afilu ba'oleh shal hadas. There are those that are matir to make this marzev out of the hadas leaf, b'mokaim sheyesh lo harbe ketumim, as long as you happen to have like a pile of these leaves that are already detached from the ground. Ve'en lacha shebeyiktaim, so that there's no concern that if we allow you to use this leaf, you might then come to pluck one off of the hadas bush. So again, we have two mandiyamrim over here in this sif. The first one said you're not allowed to make a marzev out of a hadas leaf. Why gzera? If we allow you to make a marzev out of the hadas leaf, you might actually go build an actual marzev out of wood or out of metal. That would be tikkun moneh. The Ramah brings down an opinion that's makel. You want to make a marzev out of a hadas leaf? Go ahead, no problem. That doesn't constitute tikkun moneh. But it has to be that you have a bunch of hadas leaves available that are already detached from the bush. Because otherwise, we're afraid that if we allow you to use a leaf, you might come to pluck a leaf off the tree. That would be a problem. That would be toilish on Shabbos. That would be an Issa Daraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, very interesting Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Chaf Beis. So the Ramah was the makel opinion that you're allowed to do this. Da, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber said that it's usher to use the leaf to make a marzev. Why? Because it looks like you're making a marzev and you might come to actually make a marzev. That was the Mechaber. The Ramah Messiah, and then the Ramayan's often says, Ve'ein lachu shema yiktoim. You could go use a leaf, and we're not chayshish that you might come to pluck a leaf. When? When you have a pile of leaves that are already detached from the ground. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the background to this machlokes, the Mechaber and Ramah, who plucked the Amaroi b'Gemara? This is actually a machlokes Amaroim in the Gemara, Rav Ashi and somebody else that I remember. Chad Amar Tama Isser Shema Yasa Marzev. It's a machlokes Amaroim in the Gemara. The Gemara says you're not allowed to take the hadas leaf and use it to make a marzev. Question is, why not? The answer is, it's a machlokes Amaroim, why not? One man, the Amar says, the reason you're not allowed to use a hadas leaf has nothing to do with making a marzev. The reason you can't use the hadas leaf is because if we allow you to use a hadas leaf, you might come to pluck a hadas leaf, which is the av malach of toilish. But if you have a pile of already plucked leaves, that mitigates the problem, and then you would be allowed to. Varminon, my benayu, right. One says it's a marzev problem, the other one says it's a plucking problem. Varminon, and the Gemara says, my benayu, is there a practical nafkamina lahalacha between what the reason for the Yisr is? And the Gemara says, yes, the katim umanchi. The nafkamina lahalacha is, what if there's a pile of leaves already plucked, and therefore we have no reason to be afraid that you might pluck a leaf? According to Man Yamar, that the problem is chayshid and sheba yitloish, so then it's fine. Over here we're not chayshish, because you have 20 plucked ones. Why would you pluck a new one? According to Man Yamar, that the problem is making a marzev, you're making a marzev. Hainu shayil harbi ketubim b'chanim yav Shabbos lozel. Kach elach shem yav liktam. Laman dama misha marzev asar af b'kai gavna. Laman dar shem yiktam shari u'pazik harash v'ator k'man amar shema yiktam. Okay, let's go a little bit weiter. Sifov. We'll do a little bit of Sifov. Says the Mechaber, Mutter lahatiz roish hachavis. If you have a chavis, remember what we said in Sif Aleph. When it comes to the question of stira b'kelim, we said in Sif Aleph, if you have a good, intact barrel, you're not allowed to smash it, because that would be stira. Even though it's keli, doesn't matter. If it's stira gemura, if it's a bona fide act of demolishing, that's also even b'kelim. So we said if you have an intact chavis, you're not allowed to smash it. If you have a chavis garua, if you have an inferior chavis, one that had been broken and refurbished, then you are allowed to smash it, because ein stira b'kelim. Against that backdrop, says the Mechaber over here in Sivov, mutter lahatiz roish hachavis b'sayif. If you have a refurbished chavis, so you have the chavis garua, and there we say ein stira b'kelim, you're allowed to go ahead and take a sword, and you're allowed to go whack. You're allowed to whack off the top of the chavis. So this is not the same halacha as Sif Aleph. In Sif Aleph, the halacha was, if you have a refurbished chavis, you could smash it. You could punch a hole in the side. You could take it, throw it on the floor, and smash it. Why? Because it ain't stira b'kelim. Because it's not stira gemura, because it's a refurbished chavis. That's not the halacha here in Tzivav. Over here, you're not smashing the keli. Over here, what you're doing is you're taking a sword, and with a powerful swipe, you're cutting off the top of the chavis. So the chavis remains largely intact. You didn't destroy it. What you did was, though, you made an opening, right? You cut off the top, so you made an opening. Now remember what we learned in Sif Aleph. We said that by a chavis gerua, you're allowed to smash it, because ein stira b'kelim, but are you allowed to make a Pesach Yafeh? Are you allowed to make a nice opening? No. Because to make a nice opening, even in inferior keli, is tikkun moneh. You're fashioning a reusable opening. You're leaving the keli intact, and you're fashioning a nice, proper, functional, reusable opening. So that's tikkun moneh. But here in Sivav, we're saying to slice off the top of the chavis with a sword, that you are allowed to do. And it's not a problem of stira, because we're talking about a chavis gerua. It's also not a problem of tikkun moneh. Why not? Says the Mechaber, Mota lahatis rosh chavis b'sayis, the lav lepesach mechavein. Because when we see you slice off the top of the barrel, that's not called tikkun moneh. That's not called that you have kavana to make a proper opening. Kevan shemesir roisha. You didn't make an opening. You ruined the keli. You chopped off the whole top of the keli. That's not what you do with a chavis. When you make an opening in a chavis, you make an opening. You don't slice the top off. So this does not constitute tikkun moneh of fashioning an opening. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chav Gimel. Mutar lahatis. First of all, the ein binyan stira b'kelim. This is an application of ein stira b'kelim. Umayri b'chavis gerua. We're talking about an inferior refurbished chavis. Shemedubak shvareh b'zefes. This is a chavis that had been broken and reglued. V'loy b'shleima, but we're not talking about an intact one. Because if it was an intact chavis, this would constitute stira, and it would be stira gemura, so that would be also. V'em yirtza lahatiz rak roish hamagufa levad, afilu b'chavis shleima shari, deloy mikri shvira, kevet she'ena mechuberes lechavis. What the Mishnah Berurah just said was like this. Let's change the case a little bit. Let's say you're not slicing off the top of the barrel. You have the barrel, and then the barrel had a cover. Now, what's the cover? So I want you to imagine a barrel with an open top. And now you have a lid that goes onto the top of the chavis. This lid is kind of like an upside-down bowl or an upside-down pot that you put and cover onto the top of the barrel. So let's say you had the barrel, and it's a nice, new, intact barrel. And you have the magufa, you have the lid that goes over the top. And now you take a sword, and instead of slicing off the top of the barrel, you slice off the top of the magufa. You slice off the top of the cover. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that would be mutter even on an intact barrel. Why? Well, very simple. You're not doing steer on the barrel. You're not smashing the barrel. You're not destroying the barrel. You're cutting the cover, not the barrel. So there's no problem of stira. Tikkun moneh, you're not making an opening on the barrel. You're busting the lid of the barrel. That doesn't constitute fashioning an opening in the barrel. The barrel has an opening, the open top. Maybe you'll tell me that it should be stira on the magufa. Maybe it's stira on the lid. The lid, it seems, cutting the lid is not considered stira gemura. I think the reason is because the lid is not considered a chashav keli, and therefore breaking it does not constitute stira gemura, and therefore that seems to be mutter. One more, we'll do two more Mishnah Berurahs here. Mishnah Berurah is called Chav Daled. The Mechaber said you're using a sayif, you're using a sword. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the klisha malachtel isem mutal tatel tzarech gufay. You might have the question, wait a second, isn't a sword muktzah? Yeah, it's muktzah because it's a klisha malachtel iser. But a klisha malachtel iser, you're allowed to be metaltel tzarech gufay. This is like using a hammer to bust open a nut. You're using the sword to cut open your chavis. And the key over here is the lav lepesach mechaven. When we see you slice off the top of the barrel, we don't see you as doing tikkun moneh to fashion an opening. Ella laharchiv moitzas faseha sheyuchal bekal likach masha besoicha. This is not called fashioning an opening. This is called, you want to cut off the top of the barrel so you can get a lot out at one time. That's what this is called. But this is not called fashioning a normal opening. The Eliyah Rabbah says over here in the name of the Marshal that you're only allowed to do this if you're doing it because you have a lot of guests. Why? There's a lot to be said about this, but the simple pshat in this seems to be that what we're a little bit concerned over here about optics. Again, we need it to be that this does not constitute tikkun maneh. Now, our default position is that this is not tikkun maneh because this is not the way you make an opening in a barrel. So it's not tikkun maneh, but the optics are bad because you are opening up a barrel. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Eliyah Rabbah, if you're doing this because you have 20 guests and you have to dole out a lot of wine quickly, then people understand the reason you're ripping off the top of the chavis is not because this is how you fashion an opening in a chavis. It's because you got to get out a lot of wine in a hurry. So because you want to get out a lot of wine in a hurry, you knock the whole top off. You know, this is kind of like the difference between when you have a can and you make a little hole in it and you're pulling it out, or you want to get this can empty in a hurry, you knock the whole top off the can and you pour it out. That's what seems to be at work over here. Let's just finish this Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you have a barrel of wine and it has a leather cover, so you have a barrel of wine, the barrel is open on top, you have a sheet of leather that's used as a cover for this barrel. You're allowed to rip the leather open to open up the chavis. So long as you don't run up against the problem of making a marzev. If you want to fashion the leather cover into a marzev, that you're not allowed to do because of tikkun maneh. But to just tear the leather open, that you are allowed to do. Why isn't there an isser here of kaireah? There's many pshatim why there's no isser of kaireah. One is you're not ripping it open precisely. Kaireah is when you cut something in a precise way. Another reason could be that this is bottled to the chavis, so we don't look at it as you're ripping something at all. This is the geya, by the way, to like the foil seals that you have on top of bottles or something, where we paskin that you are allowed to open them. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue later with more of Sifav. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua's and first Parnasset Shidduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BS Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.